It was the summer of 1998 when I found myself standing in front of an old cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. I was 27 and tired of city life after years of working long hours in a small Minneapolis office. My uncle, who'd recently passed away, left me a property he'd owned for decades. A small cabin tucked into Ironwood Ridge, surrounded by dense pine trees and rocky hills. It was a place he visited every year since he was a kid, and for some reason he decided I should have it. I never knew my uncle well. We hadn't spoken much, but when I got the letter about the cabin, I felt like it was an opportunity. Something about the idea of being off the grid, away from the noise and the endless buzz of cars and phones, sounded like a breath of fresh air. I wanted to experience the quiet, the real kind of quiet that city people never get. So I packed my old truck with camping gear, a few boxes of food, a lantern, and enough firewood for a week. I told myself I'd stay out there for as long as I could, just me and the woods. The drive north was long and lonely. Highway 61 had given way to narrower country roads, twisting through thick forests and past small lakes where the water looked dark and still. I passed a few small towns, places with dusty streets and gas stations where the owners barely looked up when I stopped to fill my tank. The air smelled different here, cleaner, with the sharp scent of pine and wet earth. When I finally turned onto the gravel road that led to the cabin, the sun was dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows that made the woods seem to close in around me. The last mile felt slower than the rest, as if the forest itself was watching me. My truck bounced over rocks and potholes until I reached a small clearing where the cabin stood. The cabin was small, rough, and weathered by years of storms and snow. The wooden boards had faded to a dull gray, and the roof sagged in places. But it looked sturdy enough. A stone chimney jutted out on one side, and a small porch with a creaky wooden swing hung from thick ropes. I stepped out and took a deep breath. The air was cold, even in July, and smelled of pine needles and damp moss. There was no sound except for the wind in the trees and the faint call of a distant loon. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A wood stove sat in the corner of the main room. A small kitchen area had a rusty sink and a few cabinets, and a worn-out cot stood against the far wall. Dust covered everything, and cobwebs hung in the corners. I opened a window to let in some fresh air and unpacked my supplies. That first night was peaceful. I built a fire in the stove, made some canned soup, and listened to the wind outside as it rattled the old windows. The quiet felt good. It was the kind of silence that makes you aware of every little sound. The creak of the wood, the scurry of mice in the walls, the distant hoot of an owl. The next morning, I woke early, pulled on my boots, and set out to explore the land. My uncle's property covered about 50 acres, mostly forest, with a small creek running along the edge. The trees were tall and thick, mostly pines and birches, and the ground was soft underfoot, covered in needles and fallen leaves. I found an old trail leading downhill toward the creek, overgrown but still visible. I followed it, stepping carefully over rocks and roots. As I walked, I felt a strange sense of being watched. It wasn't a sudden fear, more like a quiet awareness. The woods were alive in a way I wasn't used to. Birds flitting through the branches, squirrels darting across the forest floor, but also something else, something quieter. I stopped and looked around, but saw nothing out of place. By the creek, I found a small flat rock that looked like a perfect spot to sit and rest. The water was clear and cold, and I cupped my hands to drink. The sound of the running water was soothing. I stayed there for a while, just listening. When I got back to the cabin, the sun was high. I started a fire outside to grill some sausages I brought along and arranged some logs for the evening. I checked the stove and stacked some more firewood inside. I wanted to be ready if the nights got cold. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. I chopped wood, gathered water from the creek, and spent hours reading old books I brought from the city. The quiet was a strange comfort. At night, I'd lie on the cot and listen to the forest sounds. Branches tapping, animals moving, the occasional distant howl of a coyote. But then, something changed. It started with small things. One night, when I woke to check the fire, I saw a faint light flickering through the trees near the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was a firefly or maybe the reflection of the moon, but it was too steady. A small, moving light like a lantern or a flashlight. I stood still, watching it, heart beating faster. The light moved slowly, staying just at the tree line, then disappeared. I told myself it was probably hunters or campers passing by, but I hadn't seen any cars or people for miles. The next day, I noticed footprints around the cabin. Heavy boot prints in the soft earth near the back door. They were fresh and not mine. I didn't hear anyone come in or out, but whoever had left them hadn't stayed long. I checked all the windows and doors, but everything was locked tight. Nothing was missing. Still, it unsettled me. I started making sure to keep the fire going well into the night. I kept my old hunting rifle nearby, even though I didn't expect to use it. The forest was supposed to be quiet, friendly, but something felt off. On the third night, I heard footsteps outside the cabin. Heavy, slow steps circling the building. My heart hammered. I grabbed the rifle, climbed out quietly, and looked around with my flashlight. The beam caught nothing but trees and shadows. The footsteps stopped when I stepped outside, and I heard nothing else.
No voices, no rustling bushes.
I scanned the tree line, waiting, but after a few minutes, I went back inside. That night, sleep barely came. Every creak and snap made me jump. I kept the lantern on and the door locked tight. The following day, I decided to explore further, hoping that being away from the cabin might clear my head. I packed some water, food, and the rifle, then set off up the ridge. The trail was steep and rough, but the view at the top was worth it. Miles of dense forest stretching out, broken by a few shimmering lakes. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to push away the creeping feeling of unease. On the way back, I spotted something strange on the ground near the trail. A torn piece of clothing, dark and muddy, caught on a branch. I picked it up carefully. It was a sleeve, thick fabric, possibly from a jacket. I didn't recognize it. I folded it and put it in my pack. When I returned to the cabin, the sun was setting. I started a fire and sat close to it, the shadows dancing on the walls. I felt exposed, like the forest wasn't as empty as I wanted to believe. That night, the footsteps returned, closer this time, circling the cabin repeatedly. I stayed awake, watching the windows, rifle in hand. Suddenly, the glass on the front window cracked sharply. I jumped back, heart racing. The crack grew as something hit it again. I raised the rifle, ready to shoot. Then silence. I stayed frozen, listening. After a long minute, nothing more happened. I checked outside with the flashlight. The ground was disturbed, prints all around the cabin, but no one was there. I spent the rest of the night with the rifle by my side, too scared to sleep. The next morning, I found more signs that someone had been there. Scratches on the porch wood, a broken lantern on the ground, and a small pile of stones stacked near the back door, like a warning. I didn't know what to do. I was miles from any help, no cell service, and I had no idea who or what was out there. The thought of calling the police crossed my mind, but I wasn't sure if it was worth it. Maybe it was just some kids messing around, but the fear in me said otherwise. I spent that day packing my things. I decided I wasn't going to stay another night. The cabin that had seemed so peaceful and inviting now felt like a trap. As I loaded the truck, I noticed something new. A fresh footprint leading away from the cabin into the woods. It was large and heavy, like a man's boot. It stopped just at the tree line. I stared at it, feeling cold despite the sun. I got into the truck, started the engine, and took a last look at the cabin. The woods were silent again, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The drive back was fast. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I called my sister and told her I was coming home. I never went back to Ironwood Ridge. Later, I heard from a local ranger that people had reported strange sightings around that area. Hunters disappearing, campers finding their camps disturbed, but no real answers. Sometimes I think about that cabin and the nights I spent there, about the footsteps and the broken window, about the sense that someone or something was waiting just outside the trees, watching me. I never found out who it was or why they came, but I know one thing for sure. Some places in the woods are better left alone. I started the ranger job up in northern Idaho in the fall of 2012. I was 28 at the time, still figuring things out. I'd worked trail maintenance in Montana for a couple years, but this new post was more serious. It was real ranger work, fire lookout duties, backcountry patrol, wildlife monitoring, and solo weeks in the forest. My station was in Clearwater County, about 60 miles from the closest real town, and that was Orofino. The park spanned miles of wilderness, thick pine and fir forests, deep river valleys, and long abandoned mining roads that twisted off into nowhere. There were no tourist centers or manicured campsites here. It was wild land, rugged and mostly forgotten except for elk, bears, and the odd hunter. My assigned outpost was a ranger cabin near the edge of Parker Ridge, about 10 miles from the nearest forest access road. The cabin wasn't much. A single-room wooden structure with a tin roof, a wood stove, a cot, a desk, and a hand pump for water that tapped a deep well. No electricity, no cell service, no radio except a shortwave rig that barely worked unless the weather was bone dry. There was a satellite phone in a locked box only for emergencies. I hauled in supplies every other week: cans, dried food, firewood, fuel. The rest of the time, I lived out there alone, logging weather conditions, keeping tabs on trail usage, and watching for fire or poachers. Mostly it was quiet, but that October something changed. I'd gone up for a 14-day rotation. Fall had hit hard and fast. Most of the leaves were already gone, and snow was settling in the higher elevations. On the fourth day, I noticed something odd while hiking the southeast trail near Burnt Hollow. Someone had built a rock cairn in the middle of the trail, about waist-high, smooth stones stacked perfectly, with bits of moss tucked between the layers. It didn't look like something hikers would bother with, too meticulous. I pushed it over and didn't think much of it. A weird detail. Could have been a bored camper. The next morning, I hiked the same trail again to check for animal tracks. The cairn was back. Same stones, same moss. This time I noticed boot prints. Not mine. The tread was different, flat-soled, heavy. Not a hiker's boot, not military either. More like old work boots, the kind with shallow, worn lugs. They came from the direction of the ravine just east of the trail, but faded into the leaf litter before I could follow them far. I didn't report it. It wasn't illegal to walk the trails, just strange. Still, I logged it in my notebook: date, time, location. Day 6. I was chopping kindling behind the cabin when I saw something across the creek, maybe 40 yards out. A man, standing still among the trees, wearing a dark coat and something light on his head. He didn't move. I stared for maybe 10 seconds. Then I blinked, and he was gone. No footsteps, no movement through the brush. Just gone. I waited an hour, then hiked out to that spot. Found nothing but old deer prints. No fresh boot tracks, no sign of a camp. I stayed out there until dusk, circling the area. I had a bare gun with me, a short barrel .357. I kept my hand on it the whole time. When I got back to the cabin that night, I locked the door. I'd never bothered before. Day 7. Snow. Not much, but enough to coat the trails and show tracks. I checked the area across the creek again after lunch. About 100 yards upstream, I found a set of prints. Same flat-soled boots. They came down from the ridgeline, cut across the creek, and disappeared toward the northeast slope. I followed them for half a mile until they hit a rocky outcrop and vanished. No sign of anyone camping. No fire pits, no tarp, no food wrappers. Whoever it was, they were moving through without a trace. That night, I dreamt I was back in the cabin chopping wood. But every time I turned around, the pile was smaller. Then I looked at the axe in my hands, and it wasn't mine. It was rusted, the handle wrapped in old cloth. When I woke up, I checked the shed. My axe was still there, right where I left it. But I found something else. On the cabin's back wall, someone had scratched a small mark into the wood, a vertical slash with 2 horizontal lines, like a tally mark. I ran my hand over it. Fresh.
No moss, no weathering.
Whoever made it had done it recently. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat up with my back to the wall, stove burning low, bare gun in my lap. Every sound outside, the creak of trees, the groan of snow settling on the roof, made my nerves tighten. I thought about calling it in, but the sat phone was only for emergencies. And what was I going to say? Someone might be lurking out here. That wasn't much to go on. Day 9. I hiked to the nearest trail marker, a small wooden post about 2 miles west. I check them once a week to make sure they're visible. This one had been pulled from the ground and wedged upside down into a tree crotch, 7 feet up. Again, not something animals do. The wood was splintered like someone had jammed it in with force. I took it down, replaced it, and made another note. I'd barely made it back to the cabin when I saw smoke. Not from my chimney, from the tree line east of the creek. Thin and gray, rising slowly. I grabbed my binoculars. Couldn't see flames, but the smoke was definitely coming from the ravine. I waited an hour, faded. Just after dark, I heard something outside. A sharp, metallic clink, like metal on wood. I killed the lantern and listened. Another clink, then a dragging sound, soft but steady. I waited a minute, then cracked the door open with the gun raised. Nothing. The moon was bright enough to see a few feet out. My eyes adjusted. The clearing was empty, but when I stepped outside, I noticed the ground.
Boot prints.
Coming right up to the cabin door, then circling around to the back. I moved slow, heart pounding, checking the corners. When I got to the back wall, I froze. More tally marks. 3 more scratched into the wood, right beside the first one. And something was stuck in the wall. An old rusty nail hammered in sideways, bent at the end. That was enough. I went inside, locked up, and pulled the sat phone. I called dispatch and said there might be an unknown person in the area acting suspiciously. They said they'd send a deputy in the morning. Roads were bad, so he'd come by ATV. I thanked them, hung up, and spent the night by the stove again. I didn't sleep. Day 10. The snow melted a bit under the sun, but the wind picked up. Around noon, I heard the ATV coming from the west trail. I stepped out, relieved, but it wasn't the deputy. It was a man on an old 3-wheeler, bundled in thick clothing and a canvas mask. He didn't stop, just passed by the trailhead and rode up the ridge.
No bike, no radio, no wave.
I watched him until he disappeared over the hill. I waited until dark, but no one else came. I tried the sat phone again, but it wouldn't connect. Clear sky, no signal. I decided to hike out the next morning. Something wasn't right. I didn't care about protocol. I packed the essentials: gun, food, map, radio, and marked the cabin's location on a spare notepad, just in case. I left the rest behind. I didn't make it far. 2 miles out, near the ravine, I found something that stopped me cold. A small camp, Just a tarp, a fire ring, and a makeshift rack of bones. Not animal bones. Small ones, delicate, bird maybe or rabbit, but the way they were arranged, tied with cord, strung from tree branches like wind chimes, it wasn't normal. Nearby, I found a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were three things: a deer skull painted black, a child's shoe, and a photo. The photo was sun-bleached, but I could still make out the image. A man standing in front of a cabin. My cabin. But this photo had to be decades old. The trees were younger. The cabin looked new. And the man, he was wearing the same dark coat I'd seen by the creek. I left everything where I found it and hiked straight back. When I reached the cabin, the door was open. Just a crack, but it was moving in the wind. I hadn't left it open. Inside, nothing was missing, but someone had been there. The stove was cold, though I'd left it burning low. My cot had been moved, pushed against the wall, and scratched into the inside of the door were more tally marks. 12 of them now, deep and deliberate. I closed and barred the door, waited until morning, and hiked out again. This time in a different direction, due west, straight through the bush until I hit the forest road. Took all day. I flagged down a utility crew near the ranger station and rode back to town with them. I never went back to that cabin. I filed a full report. The department sent 2 rangers to investigate. They found the campsite, the bones, the photo. They never found the man. The old ranger logs for that station went back 50 years. I read through them. In 1983, a ranger named Wallace Baker went missing on patrol. His last assignment, same cabin, same trail sector. His body was never found. They decommissioned the outpost after that, boarded it up. I left the service the following spring, moved south, took a job teaching wilderness survival to kids in Boise. Easier work, safer. At night, I still see that coat among the trees. Hear the wind move through the bones. There are places in this country no one belongs, places forgotten for a reason. That cabin up on Parker Ridge, it's one of them. I was 38 the year I decided to build the small cabin. It wasn't because I wanted to live off-grid or chase some kind of dream. I just needed a place to stay, somewhere quiet, away from people and phones and the noise of everything. I'd been working construction jobs for over 15 years, always on someone else's timeline, always in someone else's space. After the divorce, I found myself in a 2-room apartment above a discount tire shop in the outskirts of Scranton. It was loud and hot in the summers, cold and miserable in the winters. I'd wake up to the smell of rubber and diesel most mornings. Something in me snapped one day and I just packed up. I had a small plot of land that my uncle left me when he passed away, about 2 acres of thick, pine-heavy forest near Potter County, Pennsylvania. He used to hunt deer out there. There was no driveway, no mailbox, not even a clear trail going in. I'd never really bothered with it, but now it seemed like the only place I could go that wasn't already spoken for. It was mid-October when I drove my old Ford Ranger up the half-flooded dirt road that ran near the edge of the property. I had a 10 by 12 shed kit in the truck bed, a sleeping bag, a few battery-powered tools, canned food, a little propane heater, and enough lumber to get a basic frame up. I didn't expect much. I just wanted a roof over my head and 4 walls I could trust. The rain started just before I got to the clearing I had picked out. It was steady, light at first, just brushing the windshield, then heavier as I backed the truck into the patch of flattened ground and killed the engine. It had been overcast all day, but the clouds had finally let go. That kind of early cold rain that slides into your bones before you even feel wet. I got out, stretched my back, and listened. Nothing but trees shifting in the wind and rain ticking off the leaves.
No birds, no bugs.
I was alone out there. I worked fast at first, thinking I could beat the worst of the storm. I'd built a few cabins before for work, so I wasn't too worried. It was just me this time, though. No crew. No one to hand me nails or level the beams. Just me, the tools, and the trees. By nightfall, I had the floor beams in place and most of the frame for the front and side walls done. I put up a tarp over 2x 2x4s and backed the truck under it so I'd have a dryish place to sleep. I was soaked, but the heater kept me from freezing. I pulled my sleeping bag into the truck bed and laid back, rain hammering down on the tarp above like drums, and stared up at the sagging plastic ceiling until I drifted off. The second day was worse. The rain didn't stop. It just kept falling, steady and hard, soaking the ground, turning the soft dirt into a thick soup. Every step I took made a sucking noise, and the whole build site started to feel like it was trying to eat me alive. My boots were always wet. My hands stung from the cold and the friction of wet wood. I hammered and sawed and cursed, trying to get the roof rafters in place. It wasn't going to be pretty. I didn't care. I just wanted shelter. Around dusk, I saw something out of place. Not movement, just something off. About 50 feet past the clearing, in the tree line, there was a broken branch that hadn't been there before. It was snapped clean, hanging like a snapped arm, fresh and green inside. I walked over to it and saw boot prints nearby, half filled with water, but definitely human. The spacing was wide, someone tall. I didn't like that. I walked the perimeter with a flashlight and my framing hammer in hand. No sign of anyone. No smell of smoke, no trash, no noise. Still, it made me uneasy. I told myself it was probably a hunter, someone passing through who hadn't seen my truck. The woods weren't exactly private, no fence, no posted signs. But still, something about those prints didn't sit right. That night, I locked myself in the cab of the truck and kept the heater low. I didn't sleep much. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something, branches cracking, rain shifting, what sounded like breathing once. But when I turned on the flashlight and looked out into the darkness, there was nothing. Just trees, just rain, just the wind. On the third day, I got the roof panels up. That was a win. The water still leaked through the seams, but I stapled a plastic tarp to the inside and nailed it down tight. Now I had a place to put my sleeping bag and tools that wasn't the truck. It wasn't warm, it wasn't dry, but it was mine. I noticed more things that day. More broken branches, more scuffed prints near the edge of the clearing. Once, I found a cigarette but near a pile of wet leaves. I don't smoke. No wrappers, no other trash. Just the one but waterlogged and half-crushed. That night, I set up a line of old soda cans with pebbles in them, strung between trees at about knee height, all around the edge of the site. Makeshift alarms. If someone walked through, they'd knock them down and I'd hear it. I lay in the cabin on a sheet of plastic and my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, listening. At around 3 in the morning, I heard the cans rattle. Not loudly, just once. A soft ting and then silence. I held my breath. Nothing followed.
No footsteps. No breathing.
No more noise. I waited until sunrise before I went outside. The line had been knocked down on the east side of the clearing. One can was crushed flat. I walked around with my hammer again, checking the trees. Still no one. The next few days blurred together. I kept working, trying to finish the walls and insulate with whatever I could get from the truck. It rained every day, steady and cold. I was always wet. My hands cracked. My boots never dried. I ate from cans. I burned scrap wood in a barrel outside just to stay warm. The trees felt like they were closing in. Every morning I found new signs. Fresh scuffs in the mud. A stick placed upright in the ground. A strip of fabric tied to a branch. Once, I swear I saw a shape move between the trees, tall, gray, just out of focus. Gone the second I turned. I didn't want to admit I was scared, but I was angry too. Angry that someone was out here messing with me, watching me, not talking, not helping, just watching. On the 6th night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark with the heater off, holding my flashlight and hammer, just listening. At around midnight, I heard breathing outside the cabin wall. Not loud, not animal-like, just slow, heavy human breathing. Close. I didn't move. I didn't even look toward the noise. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. I never heard footsteps leaving. I waited until dawn and walked outside.
No prints.
No signs. But the weirdest thing was what I found tied to my truck mirror. A small bundle of twigs, wrapped with fishing line. Inside was a clump of fur. Not animal fur. Looked like human hair. Black and coarse. I'd had enough. I spent that whole day packing. I threw everything into the truck bed, tied it all down with rope, and didn't care how much I left behind. I just wanted out. The cabin was half finished, leaning a little to one side. The roof sagged. The door wasn't on yet, but I was done. I climbed into the truck, fired it up, and backed out of the clearing, mud spitting from the tires. But as I turned onto the dirt road, I saw him, a man maybe 50 feet away, standing just inside the tree line. He was tall, maybe 6 feet 5 inches, lean, wearing a torn gray jacket and jeans soaked from the rain.
No pack. No gear.
Just him standing still, staring at me. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I didn't even look at him again. I drove until I hit pavement, then another hour until I reached a diner on Route 6. I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could breathe normally. Then I went inside, ordered coffee, and used the payphone to call a friend down in Harrisburg. I never went back to that land. I sold it 2 months later to some guy who wanted hunting property. I never told him what happened. I didn't build another cabin after that. Now I rent a small house near State College. It's noisy sometimes. The neighbors argue. The highway's too close. But the walls are solid, and I don't hear breathing outside my bedroom. That's good enough for me. I never expected anything to happen on that trip. I just wanted peace for a while. It was the summer of 2016, and I had been working long shifts on construction sites for months without any real break. My back ached constantly. My knees were wrecked from the concrete floors, and my sleep came in scattered patches. I was 34 then, living in a rented flat just outside Manchester. No kids, no real family nearby. My girlfriend had left the year before. It wasn't ugly or dramatic, just one of those endings where everything goes quiet until someone finally says what both people already know. I'd been renting a room from a mate after that, saving money, eating garbage dinners, just pushing through each day. One night I found myself online, scrolling through old forums I used to browse when I was younger. I don't even remember how I got there, but I ended up on a site listing remote holiday cottages and cabins all over the UK. I wasn't really looking for anything. I wasn't even planning a holiday, but I clicked around for a bit until one caught my eye. It was a small, old hunting cabin near the Galloway forest in Scotland. 1-bedroom place with stove, solar generator for a bit of power, surrounded by trees and an old overgrown path that hadn't seen much use in years. The ad said it had been empty for a long time but was safe, clean, and functional. The photos weren't high-res, but they showed a stone-built structure, simple interior, and a forest so thick it looked like the world ended beyond the trees.
No Wi-Fi. No TV.
No people for miles. That's what did it for me. I booked it for a week, paid in advance. No cancellation refund, which should have made me think twice. But it didn't. I just wanted out. I left early on a Saturday morning in June. It was still dark when I got in the car, loaded up with cans of beans, pasta, rice, tea bags, a crate of bottled water, a few books, my old camping torch, and a knife I'd kept from my army training days. I had this weird sense of excitement, like I was disappearing from the world for a bit, just vanishing into the trees. The drive was long and uneventful. Motorways gave way to smaller roads, then to gravel paths. I followed the instructions from the owner, a man named Keith who had sent everything over email. His messages were short and a bit odd.
No greeting.
No full stops. Just things like, key under slate near left front corner. Path down into trees is steep, drive slow. No phone signal. The last bit turned out to be true. I lost reception somewhere near the edge of Dumfries and never got it back. By the time I reached the track leading to the cabin, it was nearly 6 in the evening. The light was starting to go soft. Clouds had moved in, and a light drizzle had started to fall. The road into the woods was rougher than I expected. My car, a 10-year-old Vauxhall Astra, groaned over every rut and dip. I had to slow to a crawl. Ferns slapped at the side mirrors. Branches scraped the roof. I went down that track for what felt like half an hour before the cabin finally appeared through the trees. It looked exactly like the photos. Small, gray stone walls, sloped tin roof with streaks of rust, a short stack of chopped wood near the door, and a rusted shovel leaning against the wall. No signs of life, no signs of anyone at all. I parked in the clearing and stepped out. The forest was quiet, thick with pine, the kind of quiet that feels like it's pressing in around you. I walked around the place, found the slate, lifted it, and got the key. The lock turned easily, and the door opened with a dry creak. Inside, it smelled faintly of dust and old wood. The cabin was simple. One room with a small bed pushed against the wall, a cast iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a narrow counter with a basin and water jug. There was a cupboard with some basic pots, a broom leaning in the corner, and an oil lamp on the windowsill. A door led to a cramped toilet with a composting seat.
No shower. No sink.
Just a jug of water and a towel rail, but it felt solid. Felt like it would hold up to a storm, and I liked that. I spent the rest of the evening settling in, unpacked the food, stacked a bit of wood, lit the stove, made a simple dinner, and read by torchlight. It rained most of the night. Not heavy, just that constant pattering that made everything feel more isolated. I slept like a brick. The first couple of days were uneventful, peaceful even. I took slow walks through the trees, stuck close to the marked trail near the cabin. I brought a book with me each time and would stop and read when I found a dry log. No one else ever passed by. Not a hiker, not a dog walker. Nothing. On the 3rd night, something changed. It was nearly midnight, and I just put out the lamp and crawled into bed. The rain had stopped for the first time since I'd arrived, and the silence was deeper than before. I remember lying there in the dark, hearing the ticking of the stove as it cooled. Then I heard something else, a sound like someone moving through leaves. It was soft at first. I thought it might be an animal, a deer maybe, but it grew louder, closer, the crackling of twigs, a slow rustling. I sat up. The window beside the bed was covered by an old curtain, but it didn't sit flush. I could see out through a gap if I leaned close enough. I stayed still for a long time, listening, holding my breath. The sound stopped. Then, I heard something I can't explain away. 3 clear, slow footsteps on the gravel outside the front door. I didn't move. My heart was pounding. I waited, staring at the door, expecting to hear a knock or a voice, but nothing happened. I finally picked up the torch, got out of bed, and stepped to the window. I angled the beam carefully through the gap, and I saw her, a woman, maybe in her 60s, thin, with long gray hair hanging wet around her face, wearing a dark coat that reached below her knees. She was standing about 15 feet from the door, slightly turned away from me, as if looking off into the trees. Her hands hung at her sides. She didn't move, I turned off the torch and stepped back, heart thudding. I didn't know what to do. There was no signal. No one knew I was out here except the owner, and I hadn't spoken to him directly. I didn't have a gun, just the army knife in my bag. And she hadn't done anything. She hadn't knocked or called out. I stood there for almost 10 minutes watching the curtain. I couldn't see her anymore. Eventually, I moved to the door and checked the bolt. It was solid. I pushed a chair under the handle anyway. I stayed awake until dawn, holding the knife and listening to the silence. In the morning, there was no trace of her.
No footprints.
Nothing. The gravel looked undisturbed. I tried to tell myself I imagined it, that maybe I'd fallen asleep and dreamed it, but I hadn't. I took a walk to clear my head but stayed close. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. Every broken branch, every bird call felt off somehow. The trees looked darker. The air felt colder, even in the sunlight. That night, I barely slept. I kept the lamp on. I thought about leaving, but the idea of driving that track in the dark made my stomach turn. I told myself I'd leave first thing in the morning, pack up and go home, but I didn't get the chance. At some point in the night, I must have dozed off. I woke suddenly. The lamp was still on. The stove had gone cold, and the door was open. The bolt was still slid across, but the door, heavy as it was open a few inches, scraping against the chair leg. I stepped out of bed and reached it slowly. My hands were shaking. I closed it, rebolted it, and put the chair back. Then I turned and saw something that made my blood run cold. On the small table beside the stove, where I'd left my cup, there was a single long gray hair. I didn't wait until morning. I grabbed my bag, my torch, my keys, and I left. I didn't even stop to check the rest of the place. I got in the car and drove down that track faster than I should have, bouncing over roots and rocks. I didn't stop until I saw proper road again. I slept in the car that night on the side of the motorway. When I got back to Manchester, I tried to find the listing. It was gone. The site had removed it. I searched for the owner's name, Keith, but found nothing. The email address bounced back as invalid. I tried to tell a couple of people what happened, but it sounded thin even to my own ears. A woman in the woods? An open door? A hair? But I know what I saw. I know I didn't imagine it. I still think about that place, about how silent the trees were, about the way she stood, slightly turned, as if listening to something deep in the forest. And I think about the door, how it was still bolted, still secure, but somehow still open. I don't care what anyone says. That wasn't a mistake. That wasn't the wind. That was someone who knew that place better than I did. Someone who knew how to get in without a sound. Someone who had done it before. Someone who will probably do it again. But not to me. Never again. It was September of 2013. I had just turned 32 and decided to take a break from the city after a rough year. I'd recently gotten divorced, and the stress from the split had started bleeding into my job. My boss gave me a week off, mostly because I was showing up late and leaving early. I had nowhere to really go. My family was distant, and I didn't want to spend the week in my apartment surrounded by my ex-wife's old books and the frying pan she never let me use. A friend of mine, Mark, had mentioned a cabin his uncle used to own out on the plains near a small town in Nebraska. The place hadn't been used much since the old man passed away 2 years ago, but Mark said the land and house were still in decent shape. He'd been there a few months earlier to check on it and said it was quiet and still, with big skies and not a soul around for miles. That's what I wanted.
No nachbors, no unas, no Wi-Fi, no reminders.
The drive took about 8 hours. I remember feeling better just watching the skyline open up, fields of yellow corn stretching forever on both sides of the road. By the time I reached the gravel turnoff that led to the cabin, The sun was dipping low. A long dirt path lined with barbed wire fences cut through the land. Grass leaned into the road from the edges, brown and dry, like it hadn't rained in weeks. The cabin wasn't what I expected. It looked more like a small farmhouse. 2 floors, wooden porch, green shutters with chipped paint. There was a barn off to the left, a windmill behind it that creaked slowly in the breeze. A row of trees ran along the back edge of the property. Beyond that, nothing but land and sky. There was no lock on the door. I stepped inside and was hit with that thick, musty air that you only find in places no one's lived in for a while. It wasn't dirty, just old. A layer of dust coated the floorboards and the kitchen counter. The furniture was still there. A couch, a few chairs, an old dining table. A rifle hung on a rack above the fireplace, and a set of antlers sat on the mantel. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms, one with a single bed and the other with a cot folded against the wall. I dropped my bag and supplies in the main room and sat for a while just listening to the quiet. That first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner from the canned goods I brought and had a beer while sitting on the porch. The wind had a dry, whistling sound to it. No cars.
No barking dogs.
Just that wind and the creaking from the windmill. I slept well, probably for the first time in months. The next day, I walked the property. The grass out back was overgrown. The barn door was stuck at first, but I managed to pull it open. Inside were old tools, stacks of hay, rusted equipment, and a pitchfork leaning in the corner. A few rats scurried when I stepped in. I found an old ATV under a tarp, but the tires were flat and the gas smelled sour. I spent most of the day fixing up the porch, tightening nails, brushing away cobwebs, even scrubbing the windows. It felt good to move, to sweat, to do something that didn't involve screens or meetings. I grilled some meat over the old fire pit that night and sat outside until the stars came out. Felt like I could see every one of them. That night, though, something woke me. I don't know what time it was, probably around 2 or 3 in the morning. It wasn't loud, just a light noise. Click, maybe, a rustle. I sat up in bed and listened. It sounded like something brushing against the outside wall of the cabin. Not fast or violent, just movement. Then it stopped. I waited a while longer but didn't hear anything else. I went back to sleep. The next morning, I checked outside. The dirt along the edge of the cabin didn't show any prints. Nothing seemed disturbed, probably an animal. There were raccoons and coyotes in the area, Mark had said. Still, something about it sat with me. I decided to keep myself busy. I hauled some of the old hay out of the barn and burned it, cleaned out the bottom floor of the cabin. I found a locked box under one of the floorboards, but it was just full of old papers. Deeds, faded receipts, a few photos of a woman holding a baby in front of the barn. The dates were from the 80s. That night, the noise came back. This time, it was definitely movement, slow, like someone walking across the porch. Not pacing, but stepping once every few seconds. I held my breath and waited.
No knocking.
No voice, just steps. I grabbed the rifle from above the fireplace. I checked it earlier that day. There were still a few rounds in the drawer by the kitchen. I didn't open the door, but I stood at the window, peering out from the side. Nothing. After a few minutes, the steps stopped. I stood there for maybe another 30 before I finally sat down. I slept on the couch that night with the rifle propped against the wall. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside. Not boots, bare feet. Adult-sized. The prints came from the field, crossed the porch, then circled the cabin once before heading toward the barn. I didn't see any other tracks.
No tire marks.
No horse or ATV. Just those feet. I should have left right then. Should have packed my things and driven straight back to Omaha. But I didn't. I told myself it was just some drifter, or maybe a local kid messing around. But deep down, I didn't buy that. There were no broken windows. Nothing was taken. No spray paint or signs of vandalism, just those silent, slow steps. I spent that day inside, rifle close by. Every so often, I'd look out toward the tree line. Nothing moved. I didn't eat much. The windmill kept turning, that dry squeak echoing across the property. That night, the steps came back. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. I heard the wood creak near the front door, then the window beside it, then the side of the cabin, like whoever it was pressing their hand along the wall, testing it. Then silence. I waited with the rifle in my lap for hours. I didn't sleep at all. At first light, I went out again. The prints were back, same bare feet, but this time they were all over the porch. And there was something else, small scratches on the wood. Not claw marks, more like fingernails, pattern, almost like they were dragging their fingers along the siding, making loops. I walked to the barn with the rifle. Nothing inside, still smelled of dust and hay. I checked behind the tools under the workbench. Nothing. That afternoon, I set up a trap. I used an old tin pot tied to some fishing line I found in the kitchen drawer and ran it across the porch steps. If anyone stepped on it, it would rattle loud enough to wake me. I put one by the back door too. That night, I sat on the couch again. Lights off, rifle in hand. Heart pounding so hard I thought I could hear it in my ears. Just after 2, the pot on the back porch clanged. I jumped up and went to the window. Nothing there, but the prints were back in the morning. More of them, dozens, like someone had paced around for hours. The weirdest part? No trail, no beginning or end. Just footprints in the dirt all around the house, overlapping like a dance. But no prints coming from or going back to the trees. That was my last night there. I packed at sunrise, grabbed my bag, the rifle, the cans I hadn't opened. I didn't even bother to clean up. I didn't even lock the door behind me. On the drive out, I didn't see another car. No animals, not even birds, just that open land and sky. I made it back to the city by evening and crashed at a motel. I didn't tell anyone, not Mark, not my boss. I just said the cabin had a mold problem and wasn't safe to stay in. But I still think about it. The bare feet, the fingernail scratches, the silence. I don't know who or what was out there. A hermit, maybe. Someone not right in the head, living off the land, watching the cabin from the trees. Maybe someone who used to live there. Maybe someone who never left. All I know is they never tried to break in, never made a sound, just walked and watched, and I left before they changed their mind. It was October 2019 when I took a break from everything. I had just turned 41 that summer. I'd been living in Liverpool for the last 6 years, working nights as a logistics supervisor at a shipping warehouse. The job paid well, but it wore me down. That year had been one long stretch of stress. I barely slept. I barely spoke to anyone. 1 week before I left, I got into an argument with my manager over a forklift accident that I wasn't even involved in, and I realized how frayed my nerves had become. That's when I decided to get away from people altogether for a while. A friend of mine, Greg, had moved up to Scotland the year before to work at a conservation site in Dumfries and Galloway. When he heard I was looking for peace, he offered me access to a small wooden cabin his cousin owned, tucked in the forest, not far from the edge of a disused quarry. I liked the sound of it immediately. Quiet, remote, cold, no reception, just me and the woods. The cabin wasn't anything fancy. It was just a long rectangle, made of weathered timber with a sloped roof, a front porch with 2 broken chairs, and a small shed off to the side. Inside was one large room, bed in the corner with stove, tiny table, and a rusted sink that pulled water from a tank outside. There was no toilet, just an outhouse about 20 meters behind the shed. No electricity, no gas. Greg had dropped off a box of supplies the week before. Candles, long-life food, bottled water, a portable solar charger, and a map. I drove up on a Tuesday morning, parked the car about half a mile down the forestry road, and carried my things the rest of the way in one trip. By mid-afternoon, I had a fire going inside, a meal heating on the stove, and a plan to stay a full 10 days, maybe more if I felt good. For the first 3 days, I did very little. I walked in the mornings and chopped some wood in the afternoons. I read from a paperback I found inside the cabin, a 1980s thriller with bent pages and faded ink. I kept a notebook too, scribbling little thoughts, nothing important. Mostly, I just sat. My body started to loosen up. My mind slowed down. The silence didn't scare me. If anything, it felt overdue. But on the fourth night, things started to shift. It rained heavy that evening, thick drops pounding on the tin roof. I was dozing off in bed, wrapped in 2 blankets, the fire just embers now, when I heard something loud echo from outside. Not thunder, this was sharper. I sat up and waited. A few seconds later, there it was again. A hollow, metallic bang. It came from the direction of the shed. I pulled on my boots, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped out into the rain. The torchlight cut through the dark in a thin, shaking beam. I moved past the porch, through the muddy patch where I'd been splitting logs earlier that day, and stopped near the shed. I expected the wind had knocked something over. The shed was padlocked, but its side walls were made of old tin sheets, loose in spots. I figured one had flapped and hit the frame. I scanned around. Nothing moved except the trees, swaying heavy with the wind. I turned back toward the cabin, but I hesitated. That's when I saw it. There were boot prints in the mud. Not mine. They led from the tree line, thick forest, mostly pine, and stopped right behind the shed, where the ground turned to grass and rock. They were deep, fresh, pointed directly toward the back of the building. I crouched down, checked the size. Bigger than my own foot, wider too. The rain started to fall heavier, blurring the flashlight's beam. I backed up and walked quickly to the cabin, locked the door behind me, and stayed up until the fire died out completely. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I went to check again. The prints were mostly washed away, just a vague indentation left in the mud. I told myself it could have been anything. An old track, maybe a delivery boot from the cousin's last visit. But something didn't sit right. I kept looking toward the woods. There were no broken branches, no snapped leaves, no paths made by deer or badgers. But that single pair of boot prints had appeared, walked behind the shed, and then disappeared. That day, I didn't go walking. I just stayed inside and kept the fire going. The clouds lingered, but the rain held off. I opened the cabin's small window to get some air, but didn't feel any calmer. I kept thinking of the prints. That night, I didn't hear anything. No bangs, no movement, no wind, just the crackling of firewood and the occasional creak of the roof settling. I let myself fall asleep after midnight. Then came the 5th night. Around 2 a.m., I woke up cold. The fire had gone out. I reached for the flashlight but stopped. Something felt off. I listened closely. Outside, in the silence, I heard a very soft crunch. Then another. Footsteps. I held my breath. They came slowly, maybe 5 seconds between each one. The ground was wet still, and whoever was walking was deliberate about where they stepped. It sounded like they were moving across the grass just in front of the porch. Then came a new sound, the creak of the front step. One step, then another. Whoever it was, they were now standing right outside the front door. I stayed in bed, completely still. My body felt like it was locking up. I couldn't reach for anything without making noise. So I waited, my ears strained against the quiet. The next sound I heard made my blood freeze. It was the soft, clicking sound of someone slowly trying the doorknob. Not forcing it, just checking. Click, 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 then silence. I sat there, not moving, not breathing. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I couldn't hear anything else, no retreating steps, no shift on the porch. Whoever had been there wasn't trying to get in. They were just testing. Eventually, the sky began to lighten. The cabin slowly shifted from black to gray to dull blue. When I was sure the sun was coming up, I stood and unlocked the door. There were muddy footprints on the porch. Not old ones. Fresh, wet, and deep. They led from the trees to the cabin and then disappeared again into the grass. Same size as before. Same direction. No others nearby. This time, I didn't try to explain it away. I packed up some gear, grabbed the knife from the shed, and made a fire that afternoon with extra wood. I didn't leave the cabin at all that day. I kept the flashlight near and the axe closer. Night came quick. The clouds returned. I locked the door, latched the window shut, and didn't even bother to lie down. I sat in the corner with a blanket and kept the fire roaring. It was just past midnight when the noise came again. Not from the porch this time, from the back of the cabin. A soft scraping, then a bang. I moved to the window and tilted the glass just enough to look outside. I saw him, a tall figure, no coat, just heavy boots, dark trousers, a long-sleeve shirt. He was pacing around the back corner of the shed. He moved slowly, like he wasn't in a rush, like he'd done this before. He stepped up to the back wall of the shed and leaned in, running something along the side. A metal rod? A crowbar? Couldn't tell. Then he stopped, turned toward the cabin. Even though I was hidden, I felt like he was looking right at me. He stepped forward once, then again. That's when I did something I still don't understand fully. I threw open the door and shouted. He didn't run. He didn't yell back. He just stood there. Then he slowly turned and walked straight back into the woods. I didn't sleep again that night. At first light, I walked down to the old quarry edge, a place Greg had told me was used in the 70s before being shut down. There was no real cliff, just a big drop-off with pools of water at the bottom, overgrown with reeds and moss. I followed a trail nearby and found something strange. A tarp, laid flat and weighed down by stones. I lifted it. Underneath was a pile of food wrappers, cigarette butts, 2 empty water bottles, and a pair of torn gloves. Whoever had been watching the cabin had been camping nearby. I didn't know what he wanted. He wasn't trying to rob me. He could have smashed the door easily. He wasn't just hiking through either. He had a hiding place. He had patience. And he'd been there at least 2 nights, maybe more. I left the tarp as I found it and went straight back to the cabin. I packed everything. By noon, I was walking back to the car. I didn't run, but I didn't stop once. I never looked behind me. When I got to the road, I saw a large stone had been placed behind one of the tires. Not something that would stop the car, just something to slow me down. That was enough for me. I drove all the way back to Liverpool that same day. Didn't stop for fuel. Didn't stop for food. I called Greg when I got home, told him everything. He didn't know what to say. He'd gone out to the cabin 2 weeks later with his cousin and found the shed had been broken into. The lock was gone. Inside were cigarette butts, food scraps, and a pile of empty wrappers. Someone had been living there watching the cabin. They never found out who. I didn't go back. I haven't been in a forest since. I still don't know what that man wanted. Maybe he was just unstable. Maybe he was planning something worse. All I know is he watched me. He got close, and he waited for me to notice. If I hadn't left when I did, I don't think I'd be writing this now. I was 36 when it happened. It's been 5 years, and I haven't told many people. Not because I'm ashamed or anything, but because it's hard to explain it all without sounding like I've lost it. But everything I'm about to write is exactly how I remember it. I didn't hallucinate anything. I didn't drink. I didn't take anything. I was just a guy trying to get home through the backcountry and made a stupid decision. It was late September 2018. I had just finished a job in Spokane, Washington. I was working construction at the time, installing a new water main under an old road near the industrial side of town. The contract was up, and I had about 4 days before I had to be back in Bend, Oregon for the next one. I figured I'd take the scenic route down, get away from the highways and take the old logging roads through the mountains. I had a beat-up Toyota Tacoma, lifted a bit, mud tires, a winch. I'd taken it through worse. I had a tent, a cooler full of ice and food, my camp stove, a pistol in the glove box, and a bedroll in the back seat. I wasn't some city guy pretending to be outdoorsy. I'd grown up around the forests of southern Oregon, spent most of my 20s doing trail work and wildland firefighting. I knew how to read a map, fix a flat, and walk for miles if it came to it. The first day was fine. I made good time through the Palouse and into the forests west of Pullman. Slept at a little clearing by a stream. No one around. Crisp air, stars, the works. The second day, I headed into the Wenatah-Tucannon Wilderness area, thinking I'd cut southwest from there through a stretch of country I didn't know that well. My GPS didn't have the best signal, but I had paper maps and compass. I thought I could handle it. Around midday, I took a road that didn't show up on my newer map but looked old and solid enough. Gravel, a little grown in on the sides, but still traveled. Probably some hunters or locals used it. It was headed in the right direction, and I figured it'd loop back toward one of the main forest roads eventually. After about an hour of driving, the road narrowed. Brush scraped the sides of the truck. I passed no signs, no cabins, no tire tracks. It started to rain. Not a downpour, but that steady cold mountain kind of rain that sinks into your bones. I kept going. That was mistake one. By late afternoon, the road was little more than a pair of ruts. The rain made the soil soft, and the truck slipped more than once on the turns. I finally came around a bend and saw the road had completely washed out about 30 feet ahead. A chunk of earth had slid down into the ravine, taking the road with it. No way around. I cursed, put the truck in reverse, but backing up the winding road in the rain didn't feel safe either. I didn't want to get stuck. I got out and looked around. The trees were thick, the road was slick, and it was going to be dark soon. I decided to look for a place to turn around further back. I drove for maybe a mile before I saw a gap in the trees on the right. It looked like an old driveway or a spur trail, barely visible from the main road. I turned in. The track went down a short slope, crossed a small creek that was running fast from the rain, and curved into a thicket of pine and alder. About 50 yards in, the trees opened up into a small clearing. That's where I saw the cabin. It sat about 20 feet from where I parked. Old, would grade by time and rain. Roof slumped on one side. No glass in the windows. Porch sagging with rot. Looked like it hadn't been touched in 50 years. Maybe more, but there was something about it. Something off. It wasn't just the way it looked. I've seen plenty of old cabins, hunting shacks, ranger stations, all of that. This one felt wrong, like it didn't want to be found, like it had been forgotten on purpose. The air was dead still around it. Even though the wind was moving through the trees behind me, in the clearing there was no movement. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of rain hitting the roof. I got out and stretched my legs, looked around. I wasn't planning on going inside. I thought maybe I'd turn around here and find a safer spot to camp up the road. But I walked closer to the cabin anyway. Something drew me. The door was gone, just an empty frame. Inside it was dark. The floor had mostly collapsed in places. I stepped onto the porch, careful not to put weight on the corners. Under the eaves, I could smell the old wood, the rot, and something else, like rust and damp cloth. There were broken shelves, pieces of a table, and an old cast iron stove in the corner. The chimney had half fallen through the roof. A pile of debris sat in one corner, branches, pine needles, maybe animal bedding. But no smell of animals.
No scat. No nests.
I heard a noise behind me and turned quick, heart jumping. Just a squirrel. Ran across the clearing and disappeared into the woods. I laughed at myself, turned to leave. That's when I saw the second structure. Smaller, maybe 30 feet behind the cabin. Almost invisible through the trees and brush. Looked like a shed or smokehouse. It had no roof anymore, just leaning slats and moss-covered beams. Something about it made me uneasy. I didn't go over to it. I got back in the truck, turned around with some effort, and started to drive out of the clearing. But the creek I had crossed, it had risen. The rain must have picked up upstream. The crossing, which had been shallow enough for my tires, now had water pushing up to my running boards. Fast, brown, full of debris. I tried it anyway. Got halfway across before the truck tilted to the right. Back tires lost grip. I gunned it. The engine roared, tires spun, but I wasn't moving. I was stuck. I got out in the rain, boots sinking into the mud under the water, winch cable in hand. There was a tree just ahead, solid enough to anchor to. I hooked up, went back, flipped the switch. Nothing. The winch whined, then clicked dead. The water was still rising. I tried to reverse. No movement. Forward. Nothing. I killed the engine. Sat for a while. It was almost dark. Rain still coming down. I had two choices. Stay in the truck overnight and wait for the water to recede, or go back up to that cabin and get out of the rain. I should have stayed in the truck. But the cab was cold, wet, and if the creek rose more, I'd be sleeping underwater. I grabbed my pack, flashlight, and the pistol from the glove box. I walked back through the clearing and stepped onto the porch. Inside, it was dark, but dry. I found a corner that looked solid, cleared off the worst of the debris, and unrolled my bedroll. The air stank, mildew, old dirt, something else I couldn't name, but it was dry. I sat there for a long time, flashlight in hand, just listening. The rain on the roof, the wind in the trees, nothing else. Eventually, I dozed off. I woke up to a thump. Not loud, just a dull sound from outside the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding, ears straining. Nothing, just the rain. I waited. Another thump. Closer. Maybe from that second structure I'd seen earlier. Then a dragging noise. Faint, like something pulling something heavy through wet leaves. I held the flashlight but didn't turn it on. Didn't want to be seen from outside. The sound stopped. I waited. An hour passed. Nothing. Sometime later, I must have fallen asleep again. When I woke up, it was light. Gray, wet morning light coming through the empty window frames. My back ached. I stood up, stretched, and stepped outside. The rain had stopped. The air smelled cleaner. The creek looked lower. I walked around the side of the cabin. That's when I saw them. Tracks. In the mud. Not animal. Human. Barefoot. Deep heel prints. White toes. Not fresh, but not old either. A full trail of them, leading from the shed to the cabin. Right up to the wall beside where I'd been sleeping. My stomach dropped. I followed them back toward the shed. The structure was worse up close. Half collapsed. Rotting beams. A rusted saw on a hook. Broken wooden crates. I stepped around the edge carefully. Inside was a hole. Not a pit. Not a well. A hole. Dug deep. Too clean. Walls packed tight. 6, maybe 7 feet across.
No ladder.
No sign of dirt piled nearby. Just a void in the ground. I stared at it. The air around it was cooler. There were more tracks around the hole. I backed away. I didn't check anything else. I went straight back to the truck. The creek had dropped just enough. I started the engine, rocked the truck back and forth, wheels spinning, engine straining, until I finally lurched free. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. 3 hours later, I didn't look back. I've told myself all kinds of things since then. That it was an old trapper's homestead. That animals made those sounds. That the tracks were just some hunter messing around. But I know what I saw. The cabin wasn't on any map. The shed wasn't built for storage. And that hole, someone made that hole. Not decades ago. Recently. Whatever was out there, I didn't stick around to meet it. I never took the back roads again. And I never went back to that part of the forest. I was 37 when I finally took a break from everything. After working straight through my 20s and most of my 30s as a land surveyor in Montana, I burned out. I didn't realize it until I started sleeping through my alarm every morning, or when I forgot my mom's birthday even though I'd marked it twice on the calendar. I didn't want to call it a breakdown, but something had cracked. My doctor called it stress-induced fatigue, told me to take a few weeks off.
No screens. No noise.
Get fresh air, walk, eat well. I nodded through the appointment and left feeling like I'd been given permission to disappear. So that's exactly what I did. My dad had a small hunting cabin up near the edge of Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest. We hadn't been close in the last few years. He passed in 2017, but the cabin was still technically in my name. I hadn't visited it since the funeral. No electricity, no running water, just an old generator, a dry well, a wood-burning stove, and the sort of peace I hadn't known in years. The perfect place to clear my head. I threw a cooler, a .22 rifle, some canned food, 2 jugs of water, a hatchet, and some firewood into my truck and drove west for almost 6 hours. It was the second week of October, 2022. I remember the last paved road turned into gravel around mile marker 147. After that, it was nothing but winding dirt tracks, sharp turns, and tall pines closing in like dark green walls. The air got colder as I climbed higher. I could see snow still clinging to the shadowy sides of some peaks. The road was rutted and washed out in spots, and the only thing that got me through was 4-wheel drive and muscle memory from the years I'd spent here as a teenager. I reached the cabin just before dusk. It sat in a dip between 2 hills, not visible from the road. Just a rectangular box of rough timber with a slanted metal roof and a creaky porch. The window shutters were still on, the front door a little crooked on the hinges. I backed the truck up to the porch and started unloading. Everything looked almost untouched, like time hadn't really touched this place since my dad died. Even the rust on the hinges looked familiar. Inside was cold and smelled like dry rot and mouse droppings. I aired it out, opened the shutters, and swept away a few piles of acorns and chewed up insulation. Then I lit a fire in the stove and sat there in my dad's old recliner, watching the flames settle into place like I'd never left. The first 2 days were quiet. I'd walk the nearby trails with my rifle slung over my shoulder, listening to the birds, watching for elk. I found old prints in the mud, deer, maybe a wolf, something else I couldn't place. Nights were cold and dead silent, the kind of silence that settles on your chest and makes you feel like you're underwater. I'd wake up sometimes with that weird feeling, like something was watching me, but I blamed it on the creaks of old wood and the wind moving through the cracks. Then came the 3rd night. It was just after midnight when I heard it. A sound I couldn't place. Not an animal cry, not the wind, something in between. A dragging, scraping noise against the outside of the cabin, slow and deliberate, like claws being drawn across the wood. I sat up in bed, heart thudding. I didn't move, just listened. The noise circled the cabin. First at the back, then the side wall, then the front. Not fast, not loud, just enough to let me know something was out there. I stayed like that for almost an hour. At some point, It stopped, and the silence came rushing back. I didn't sleep again. In the morning, I walked the perimeter. There were no tracks, no marks on the wood, nothing I could find. Just the same ground as always, a layer of frost melting in the sun, and the trees looking exactly the same. I told myself it was a dream, maybe a raccoon or porcupine. I didn't believe it, but it helped me get through the day. That afternoon, I hiked up the old deer trail that curved around the back hill. It hadn't been used in years, but I still knew it. Halfway up, I stopped cold. There was a carcass lying in the brush, a deer torn open at the belly, but not eaten, just split down the middle like someone had opened it with a blade and left it to rot. No scavenger signs, no coyote tracks, just dried blood, matted fur, and that gaping tear from neck to stomach. I turned around and went back to the cabin before dark. The next night was worse. It started around the same time, just after midnight. This time it was louder, thumping on the side of the cabin, then footsteps, but not the sharp crack of hooves or the soft pad of paws. These were different, heavy, slow, 2 at a time, something walking upright, something big. I sat up again, listening. My rifle was next to the bed. I picked it up and walked barefoot to the door. My hand was shaking so bad I could barely keep my grip. I didn't open it, just listened. The footsteps circled again, then stopped near the front porch. I could hear breathing, deep, irregular, almost wet sounding. Then it said my name, not shouted, just spoken, but the voice was wrong. It sounded like someone trying to copy a voice they'd only heard once. Too slow, guttural, like a person imitating another person in a dream. That was when I backed away from the door and locked it. I didn't sleep that night either. By morning, whatever it was had gone. Again, no tracks, just the same cold dirt, same trees, same nothing. I didn't leave the cabin that day. I just stayed inside, watching the woods through the windows. I lit a fire early and sat with my back to the wall, rifle across my lap. I barely blinked. I didn't eat. That night, I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't outside. It was on the roof. I heard it dragging something long, deliberate, scraping sounds that echoed through the ceiling. Then the weight of it shifting slowly from one side to the other. I didn't move, didn't breathe. It stayed up there for almost half an hour. Then, just before it climbed down, it let out a sound that turned my blood to ice. Not a howl, not a growl. It was laughter, but it wasn't human. It was like someone pretending to laugh. The rhythm of it was off, too long, too breathy, like an animal copying something it had heard once and liked the sound of. The next day, I packed my bag. I'd had enough. I was going to leave, but when I got to the truck, the tires were slashed. Not punctured, shredded, long, uneven gashes like someone had taken a blade to them with too much force. That was the first time I actually felt afraid in a way I couldn't rationalize. Not worried, not startled, pure fear. I went back inside and locked everything. I stayed up that night with the rifle pointed at the door. Around 2 in the morning, something scraped against the windows. I didn't look. I didn't want to know, but it didn't go away this time. It stayed until dawn. When the sun rose and the light finally poured through the trees, I opened the door. There were handprints on the glass, muddy, twisted handprints, but the fingers were too long and the spacing was wrong, like someone with broken joints had pressed their hands to the glass. I made a fire that morning and burned all the leftover food. I didn't want anything outside to smell it. I didn't go outside to use the outhouse. I used a bucket. Then I saw it. Just before sunset, maybe 20 yards into the trees, I saw a shape standing still between the pines. Not walking, not moving, just standing. It was tall, maybe 6'5" or 6, but its body was wrong. Too lean, like it had skipped meals for a few months. Its shoulders were hunched, arms hanging too long, like it didn't understand how to hold itself upright, and its head looked like a man's. But the mouth was open wider than it should have been, and the skin around its jaw looked cracked, torn, like it had been put on but didn't fit. I didn't move. It didn't move. We stared at each other for maybe 30 seconds. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees without a sound. I blocked the door that night with furniture and slept in the corner, rifle in my arms. That was the last night it came close. The next morning, I hiked out on foot, 15 miles to the ranger station.
No sleep, no stops.
Just one long walk through the trees with my heart hammering like a motor. I didn't look back. I didn't rest. When I got there, I didn't tell them anything except that I'd had a close encounter with a bear and needed help with my tires. A week later, I sold the cabin. I didn't tell the buyer anything either. Just said it was remote, beautiful, quiet, perfect for hunting. I don't know what I saw up there. I've thought about it too much, and thinking about it doesn't help. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man. It was something in between. Something that wore skin like clothing and watched like it remembered being human. Whatever it was, I believe it's still out there, watching the trails, listening, waiting, but I won't go back. Not for anything. It was the fall of 2012 when I decided to return to the old hunting cabin in northern Minnesota. I was 38 then, divorced for about 2 years, and living alone just outside of St. Cloud. Life had slowed down a bit, and I was finding myself with too much free time on weekends. I worked a maintenance job at a public school, good benefits, stable hours, but quiet. Too quiet. That cabin had been in my family for years. My uncle built it in the late 70s on a patch of land thick with pines, maybe 4 miles from the Canadian border. We used to hunt deer and bear up there every fall. My dad and uncle used to take me there every year from the age of 10, and I kept going well into my 20s. After my uncle passed in '08 and my dad got too old to go, we just sort of let it sit. The roof was still good, and I had a key. The gravel path to it was overgrown, and I hadn't been back since 2009. I figured I'd make a solo trip in October and get a feel for the place again. It was supposed to be for nostalgia, just a quiet weekend in the woods. I left town on a Thursday morning early, before the sun came up. My truck was packed with the usual gear: camo, my Remington 30-06, enough canned food and jerky to last 3 days. I brought my old thermos, still dented from a fall in '06, and a worn flannel jacket that used to be my dad's. That drive north always brought a mix of nerves and calm. Past Duluth, the traffic thinned out until it was just semis and logging trucks. By the time I reached the back roads, it was almost noon. I pulled off onto the old gravel trail, which was barely visible under the tall grass and fallen leaves. The truck bounced over every rut in the path, and I had to get out twice to cut dead branches that had fallen across the trail. The deeper I got, the quieter it became. That kind of silence you only get when you're really out there. No cars, no power lines, no people. The cabin sat low on a clearing near a small, brackish creek. The walls were still sturdy, pine logs faded gray from years of wind and rain. The front door stuck a little when I unlocked it, but it opened with some force. Inside, the air was cold and stale. Dust covered the furniture, and there was that smell: old wood, mildew, and something else I couldn't quite place. Not rot, not mold, but a little like wet leather. I set my gear down and got to work. First thing was checking the propane tank out back. It was still intact, though I didn't plan to use it much. I had a Coleman stove and some firewood inside. The outhouse was still standing, a bit tilted, but usable. Inside the cabin, the shelves were mostly empty except for a few cans of beans and a box of matches in a glass jar. I swept out the dust, opened a window, and laid out my sleeping bag on the old bunk. By late afternoon, I had a fire going in the wood stove. I stepped out and stood on the small porch, sipping coffee and staring out at the line of trees. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows that moved slow with the wind. Felt peaceful.
Familiar.
I'd missed this. That first night, I barely slept. Not because of fear, at least not yet. It was the cold and the creaks. A mouse ran across the floor near midnight. I could hear the wind groaning in the trees like a distant train. I'd forgotten how loud the woods could be when you're truly alone. Every noise seemed closer, sharper. At one point, around 2 a.m., I heard something snap near the creek. A heavy crack. Could have been a deer, maybe a bear. I didn't check. By sunrise, I was groggy but alert. I dressed quietly, loaded the rifle, and made my way to the old deer stand about half a mile north of the cabin. The ladder was rotting, so I sat at the base, my back against a tree. I stayed there until mid-morning, seeing nothing. No movement.
No birds. No squirrels.
Just wind. That was the first thing that felt strange, how still everything was. Even back in the day, there'd always be something rustling. But that morning, it was like the forest was holding its breath. Around noon, I headed back to the cabin. I made lunch, just canned chili, and dozed off in the chair by the fire. When I woke, the light outside was fading, and something felt off. I could feel it in my chest. Pressure. The way you feel before a storm or just before someone enters a room behind you. I looked out the window but saw nothing. The trees stood still, not a single branch moving. I stepped out with the rifle slung over my shoulder. I didn't really have a reason, just wanted to shake the unease. I walked down past the creek, toward a spot we used to call the hollow. It was a dip in the land, maybe 15 feet lower than the rest of the forest floor, shaped like a bowl. As kids, we used to throw firecrackers down there. I hadn't been there in a decade. As I stepped into the hollow, the air got colder. No wind, just a drop in temperature. I scanned the ground. There were prints in the dirt, fresh ones, but not animal. Boots, deep tread, big size, maybe 12 or 13. I wear a 10.5. These were fresh, cleaner edges. Someone had been here recently, maybe even that day. The prints led toward the thicker trees, and I followed for maybe 50 yards before I lost the trail. I didn't panic then. I figured maybe a hunter had wandered too far from his stand. Still, I picked up the pace back to the cabin. I bolted the door behind me for the first time in years. That night, the wind picked up. The trees groaned louder. Around midnight, I was sitting by the fire when I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, outside. Not an animal, not the wind. I froze and held my breath. Then silence. Nothing. I didn't move until morning. At sunrise, I checked the area around the cabin. Muddy prints circled the building. Same tread as the ones in the hollow. They stopped just at the back window, where I had propped a log to keep it shut. Then they vanished toward the trees. I didn't hunt that day. I just stayed close, cleaning the rifle and checking the locks. I found myself listening to every little creak and groan in the wood. Every thump of pine cones dropping sounded like a footstep. That evening, just before dark, I hiked out toward the hollow again. I don't know why. Maybe to prove to myself it was nothing. The prints were gone, washed away by light rain. But something else caught my eye. An old trail camera, half buried in the dirt, facing the wrong way. I hadn't put that there. It wasn't ours. Someone else had been monitoring the area. I picked it up and saw it had a battery pack still attached. Dead, but it hadn't been there long. It wasn't faded or cracked. I brought it back to the cabin and left it on the table. That night was worse. At some point near 3 a.m., I woke to a noise, metal scraping. Not loud, not aggressive, just slow. I grabbed the rifle and crept toward the door. Through the front window, I could just barely make out a shape. Someone crouched by the firewood stack. I stayed still, My hand was shaking so hard the rifle barrel tapped the wall. After a minute, the shape stood, tall, thin. It moved with strange calm. I watched it walk back toward the woods, never looking toward the cabin, just walked into the dark. I didn't sleep again that night. By dawn, I had made my decision. I was leaving. Whatever this was, whoever it was, I wanted no part in it. I packed quickly and stepped outside to load the truck. The firewood stack was scattered, some pieces laid out in a straight line, pointing toward the trees. Like an arrow, I drove out fast, didn't care about the ruts or the scratches on the sides of the truck. When I reached the main road, I pulled over and threw up in the ditch. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Back in town, I tried to forget it. I didn't tell anyone. What was I going to say? That I saw a guy wandering in the woods? That someone stacked my firewood funny? I kept it to myself. But 2 weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I drove back up during the day with a friend from work. I didn't tell him the full story, just that I wanted to check on the place. When we got there, the cabin was fine. Nothing broken, nothing stolen, but the trail to the hollow had fresh prints again. Same tread, only this time there were more of them, and deeper, like someone had been pacing. We didn't stay long. Since then, I haven't gone back. I ended up selling the land in 2015 to some guy from Wisconsin. Never met him, just signed the papers through a broker. To this day, I don't know what I saw. Just a man, maybe a squatter, or someone hiding something in the woods. But sometimes I dream about that cabin. And in those dreams, I see that man again, not doing anything, not saying anything, just crouched by the firewood, staring at the door. And in the dream, I never open it, and I never will. It was the fall of 2016 when I found the listing online. A remote property in northern Idaho, an old logger's cabin on a patch of land that used to be part of a family graveyard, was up for rent at a price that felt too good to be true. I was 38 at the time, burnt out from a corporate job in Portland, recently divorced, and desperate to be anywhere but where I was. The idea of solitude, of disappearing into the woods for a few months, felt like the only kind of therapy I could afford. The ad mentioned that the place wasn't far from Priest River, about an hour or so on a winding back road. The cabin sat on land that had once belonged to a pioneer family called the Holbrooks, and it was rumored they'd buried their kin on the same property. The listing didn't shy away from it. Actually, it mentioned the graves like a selling point. Rich in local history, it said. Gravestones still standing from the 1800s. It didn't scare me off. I figured it was just rural folklore wrapped in old stones and moss. I didn't believe in spirits or anything supernatural. I still don't, but I learned there are plenty of things worse than ghosts. I packed up my truck with the basics: tools, canned food, books, camping gear, and 2 rifles. One was for hunting, the other for protection. I had no real experience with either, but I figured up there I might need to learn. When I pulled off the paved highway and started following the narrow dirt road north, I had no cell signal, no GPS, just paper instructions I'd printed before leaving. It was early October, and the trees were dropping gold all over the road. The forest looked like it was in slow decay. I passed a few old mailboxes with faded names, and eventually nothing. Just woods so thick they swallowed the light. The road ended in a clearing. That was where the cabin sat. It was a squat, single-story place with cedar walls, a metal roof, and a stone chimney. A porch sagged along the front, and the windows were covered in grime. It looked forgotten but not ruined. In a weird way, it felt like it had been waiting. The graveyard was just 50 yards to the west, on a slight rise behind a patch of broken wooden fencing. I counted maybe 9 or 10 headstones, most of them so worn down the names were unreadable. A few were tilted or fallen. The biggest was a tall cross-shaped marker with J. Holbrook, 1826 to 1898, carved into it. I set up inside, got the wood stove going, and took stock of the place. There was no electricity, no plumbing, just an outhouse out back and a hand pump for water. The inside had a small table, one bed with a thin mattress, and shelves stacked with old jars and rusted tools. There was a strange smell inside, dry wood, dust, and something else, something sour. That first night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking I heard noises outside. Twigs snapping, branches brushing the walls, wind moving in ways it shouldn't have. But I told myself it was just the forest being alive. By the third day, I settled into a routine. I'd wake at dawn, collect water, start a fire, and cook simple meals. I walked the woods in the afternoon, sometimes with the rifle slung on my back. I saw deer, heard owls, watched the sun filter through moss-covered branches. I didn't feel scared, just small. But after about a week, things started feeling different. It began with the graves. One morning, I noticed that someone had cleared the leaves off them overnight. The stones were clean, almost polished. I hadn't done it. I was sure of that, and it hadn't rained or stormed. I assumed an animal had done it, maybe scratching at the ground. But there weren't any marks, just bare earth and tidy stones. A few nights later, I was woken up by the feeling that someone was watching me. I didn't hear anything, no footsteps or voices, but it felt like something was just outside the window. I waited until morning to go check. That's when I found the prints. They were boot prints right beneath the window, deep, fresh, clear as day in the mud. But what chilled me wasn't the fact that someone had been outside. It was the fact that the prints didn't come from anywhere. There were no tracks leading to the window or away from it, just two boot prints, like whoever stood there had been dropped into the mud and then lifted back out. After that, I stopped sleeping. I'd sit up at night with my rifle across my lap, staring into the dark, listening. I started making trips into town once a week, just to feel normal again. I'd buy fresh food, fill up on gas, and talk to the clerk at the feed store just long enough to remind myself I still had a voice. One afternoon, I asked him if he knew anything about the Holbrook property. He looked up from the counter, didn't smile, just said, "That place should have been torn down years ago," and then went quiet. Back at the cabin, more things started happening. The pump out back began producing water that smelled like blood. I stopped using it after that and started boiling stream water. The second week of November, I woke up to find every single jar in the cabin emptied and lined up neatly on the floor. Nothing broken, just glass rows, like someone had arranged them while I slept. Then came the whistling. It happened at night, always around the same time, between 2 and 3 in the morning. A long, slow whistle, rising and falling, like someone trying to mimic a song but forgetting the melody halfway through. It would start at the tree line and then slowly, night after night, get closer. By the third week, it was just outside the front porch. I never saw anyone. One night, I left the rifle loaded and propped near the door. I waited. When the whistling started again, I stood up and stepped outside, flashlight in hand. There was no one there, but the graveyard gate was open. I had never touched that gate, never even walked among the stones at night, but it stood open now, wide enough for someone to walk through. That's when I started boarding up the windows. I used whatever scrap wood I could find, covered every opening, and kept only a small slit near the door to look out. I didn't go for walks anymore. I barely left the porch. I didn't care about getting better anymore. I just wanted to make it to winter so I'd have an excuse to leave. But winter came early that year. A snowstorm rolled in and trapped me up there. By mid-November, the road was impassable. I was stuck. The final night started like all the others. Cold, quiet, but something was off. I could feel it in the way the wind moved, short gusts, almost rhythmic, like someone breathing. I stayed awake again, staring at the door, waiting for the sound. At 2:14 a.m., the whistling began, but this time it didn't come from the trees. It started at the back of the cabin. It moved around the walls, slow and steady, until it reached the front porch. Then it stopped. A few seconds later, something knocked on the door. Not hard, just a slow, deliberate knock. 1, 2, 3. I raised the rifle. Didn't move, didn't breathe. The knocking stopped. Then silence. Then, without any sound of footsteps, the doorknob began to turn. Jiggled once, then again. But I'd locked it, bolted it, nailed it shut from the inside. The knob twisted a final time and then went still. I stayed in that position until morning, the rifle aimed, my heart pounding so loud I thought it would give me away. When daylight finally came, I opened the door. Nothing was there. No prints in the snow. No sign of movement. But every single grave in the yard had been dug up. Not just disturbed, completely unearthed. Shallow, muddy holes and empty. I ran. I packed what I could carry, left the rest, and hiked the 6 miles through knee-deep snow until I hit a plowed road. I flagged down a truck and got a ride into town. I told the sheriff someone had been living out there, breaking in, stealing from the graves. He took notes, nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe a word of it. I didn't care. I didn't want to go back. I signed over the rest of my lease and moved back to Portland. Never told anyone what really happened. Couldn't. I still can't explain most of it. There were no ghosts.
No spirits.
Just something human, something twisted, patient, and living in that place. Something that didn't want to share the cabin. I was 39 that summer. The year was 2016. I had been living alone for nearly 4 years by then, ever since Rachel and I divorced. We didn't have kids, just years of memories, most of which I'd rather forget. We used to spend long weekends up at the old cabin in northern Vermont. Her family had owned it since the 1960s, a quiet little A-frame tucked about a quarter-mile off a dirt road between Sutton and Sheffield. It was modest, 1 floor with stove, no plumbing, but Rachel loved it. She'd grown up spending summers there, and when we got married, I tried my best to enjoy it too. But something about that place always put me on edge. I don't know why. Maybe the isolation. Maybe the strange layout of the woods around it, like they were watching. But I never told her that. I kept it to myself, like a lot of things. After the divorce, I moved to Concord, New Hampshire, took a job doing maintenance at a hospital, and tried to keep my head down. I didn't see Rachel again after the papers were signed. Didn't want to. I knew from a mutual friend that she'd held onto the cabin. She kept it exactly the same. She was still going up there from time to time, still sleeping in the same lumpy bed we shared, burning the same wood I used to split. It made my stomach turn, the thought of her keeping that place as if nothing had changed. That summer, I was driving up to Newport for a 3-day weekend. I had a buddy who ran a bait shop there, and we'd planned some fishing and drinks. Nothing special, just time to unplug. The route took me along Route 5A, which skirts Lake Willoughby. It's a beautiful drive, tree-lined, winding, almost too quiet. I'd taken it hundreds of times over the years. But this time, I don't know what got into me. Maybe it was the weather, gray clouds heavy like wet wool. Or maybe it was the long silence in the truck, broken only by the occasional clunk of gear in the back. Whatever it was, as I passed the turnoff to the old logging trail that led to Rachel's cabin, I hesitated, just for a second, and then I turned around. I told myself it was curiosity. Closure, maybe. I hadn't seen the cabin since the divorce, and I thought maybe if I drove by it, saw it for what it really was, just a sagging old shack in the woods, it might take away some of the weight I'd been dragging around. I wasn't planning on stopping. I just wanted to pass it, see it, then keep going. The logging trail was worse than I remembered. Rutted, narrow, overgrown. My Tacoma groaned as I eased it down the incline, branches scraping the sides like fingernails. The deeper I went, the darker it got. The trees leaned in from both sides, blotting out what little sunlight the clouds allowed through. The trail twisted left, then straightened. I slowed down. The cabin would be up ahead, past the small clearing where Rachel used to park her Subaru. I expected to see her car there, maybe a wisp of chimney smoke, maybe nothing at all. But there was no car.
No smoke.
The place looked empty. I pulled up slowly and stopped about 30 feet from the edge of the clearing. I could see the cabin through the trees. Gray wood, dark windows, the same tin roof with that one corner that always curled up like a dog's ear. But it looked different, abandoned almost. The grass was taller than it should have been for July. The path to the porch was barely visible. A couple of shutters hung loose. The whole thing had a lean to it, like the woods were trying to drag it back into the ground. I sat there in the truck for a long time, engine running. My fingers were tight on the wheel. Something about it wasn't right. This wasn't how Rachel kept things. She was tidy almost obsessively. She wouldn't let the cabin go to hell like this. She wouldn't let nature take it back. Then I noticed the door. It was open, just a crack. I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. The door was open maybe 3 inches, enough to see a sliver of shadow inside. The cabin didn't have a screen door, never did. If it had been windy, it might have swung all the way open, but it wasn't windy. Everything was still, silent. I should have backed up and left right then. I should have thrown it in reverse and peeled out of there without looking back. But I didn't. I killed the engine, unbuckled, and got out. The air was thick with moisture, smelled like wet bark and rot. I stepped carefully, trying not to snap branches underfoot. My boots crunched in the gravel where the old path used to be. As I got closer to the cabin, I noticed more things that felt wrong. The stack of firewood under the window was crumbling, covered in moss. A broken mug lay in the grass, its handle snapped off. The flower boxes Rachel had built were full of weeds, and still the door hung open, quietly inviting. I reached the steps. They groaned under my weight. I stopped at the threshold. The inside was dark.
No lights, obviously.
The place didn't have electricity, but the darkness felt thicker, like the shadows had mass, like they were waiting. I pushed the door open slowly. The smell hit me first. It wasn't death, not quite, but close. Mold, urine, something chemical. It made my eyes water. The cabin was colder than it should have been. I stepped inside. Everything was covered in dust. Thick, undisturbed dust. That didn't make sense. If Rachel had been up here recently, the place should have shown signs of life. But the chairs were untouched. The table had a thin film over it. The counter still held the same old coffee can full of utensils, but even that was dusty. A spoon sat on the floor like someone dropped it in a hurry. The rug was bunched in one corner. The wood stove was cold. Then I saw the nails. There were nails driven into the walls, dozens of them, all along the far side of the cabin where the bed used to be. Each one had something hanging from it, bits of cloth, string, paper scraps. One held a child's mitten. Another held a lock of hair tied with blue yarn. My stomach twisted. I walked slowly along the wall, staring at each object. Most were unidentifiable. Burned scraps, rusty bottle caps, an old shoe sole, what looked like a dried-up frog pressed flat. It was like someone had built a shrine. Or a warning. There was no bed anymore. Just a bare floor and a dark stain where the mattress used to be. The stain spread out like something had soaked through it. I turned away, bile rising in my throat. I walked to the kitchen counter. On it sat a notebook, black cover warped from moisture. I picked it up, flipped it open. Most of the pages were blank, but a few had handwriting jagged, rushed, barely legible. I made out words here and there. Can't sleep, keeps knocking, don't go outside at night, saw it again last night. Then, one phrase, repeated over and over, it's not Rachel anymore. My chest tightened. I dropped the notebook and backed away. Something shifted behind me. I spun around. Nothing. I stared at the empty room. My breath was loud in my ears. My pulse pounded. I stepped backward, toward the door, not taking my eyes off the dark corners of the cabin. I kept waiting for something to move, but nothing did. I turned and stepped outside. The air felt thinner, lighter. I breathed in deep, trying to steady myself. That's when I saw the footprints, fresh, in the mud near the side of the cabin. Bare feet. They led away from the cabin, down the slope toward the stream. I followed them with my eyes. They disappeared into the trees. I got back in my truck and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, staring at the cabin. I wanted to believe it was squatters, or maybe Rachel had gone off the deep end, and that's why the place was in ruins. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I put the truck in reverse and backed out slowly. When I hit the main road again, I didn't stop. I didn't go to Newport. I drove straight home, shaking the whole way. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise in the house made me jump. I kept picturing those nails, that notebook. 2 days later, I called the mutual friend who'd told me Rachel still visited the cabin. I asked when she last heard from her. There was a long pause. She went missing last fall, the friend said. They think she went up to the cabin and never came back. They never found her body. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. I didn't go back. I sold the Tacoma a month later. I still dream about that wall of nails. I don't know what happened to Rachel. I don't want to know, but I'll never forget what I read in that notebook. It's not Rachel anymore, and I believe it. It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to take a break from the chaos of city life. I was 29 years old then, living in Minneapolis, working a dull office job that drained my energy and spirit. The city noise, the endless traffic, and the clatter of keyboards were suffocating me. So, I packed up my gear, loaded my old Jeep with supplies, and set out for a cabin deep in northern Minnesota's woods, far away from any trace of civilization. I wasn't alone. I brought along Max, my black Labrador, who was my faithful companion since I adopted him as a puppy 4 years before. Max was calm and steady, the kind of dog you trusted to be your shadow in the dark. The cabin was a simple, weathered structure made of rough-hewn logs, sitting beside a small lake surrounded by towering pines. I had inherited it from my late uncle, a man who lived his entire life away from society. The cabin wasn't fancy. It had a wood stove, a small kitchen, a sleeping loft, and enough space for me and Max to be comfortable. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and cell phone service was spotty at best. The idea of disconnecting and spending a week with just nature and my dog felt like a gift. The first day went as expected. I unpacked, chopped wood for the stove, set up my bed, and let Max explore the surrounding woods while I set traps for firewood. The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves, birds, and the distant splash of the lake's water lapping at the shore. The air was crisp, tinged with the smell of pine and damp earth. At night, after the stove crackled and the cabin grew warm, Max curled up beside me. His steady breathing was a comfort in the quiet. On the second day, I decided to take a hike deeper into the woods. Max was eager to follow, his nose sniffing every inch of the trail. We walked for hours, crossing small creeks and stepping over fallen trees covered in moss. The further we went, the thicker the trees became. The forest canopy almost blocked out the sky, and the sun barely reached the ground. I marked my path carefully, knowing the woods could swallow you whole if you lost your way. We reached a clearing just as the sun was starting to dip behind the hills. The clearing had the remains of an old foundation, probably the ruins of a long abandoned cabin or hunting shack. The wood was rotted, and the stones were covered in lichen, but I could imagine someone having lived there once, surviving winters in this harsh place. Max sniffed around the rubble, his ears twitching at sounds I didn't hear. There was a stillness in the air that made me uneasy, but I shrugged it off, blaming it on my imagination. As we turned back, I noticed the sky darkening faster than expected. Thick clouds rolled in, blotting out the remaining light. The wind picked up, carrying a chill that crept into my bones. I quickened my pace, but Max suddenly stopped and growled softly, his hackles raised. I scanned the trees around us, but all I saw were shadows shifting with the wind. The rain started lightly at first, then quickly became a downpour. My jacket soaked through, and the trail grew slippery with mud. I struggled to keep my footing while Max stayed close, guiding me through the wet underbrush. We finally made it back to the cabin just as the storm hit full force. The cabin's door was a blessing. I locked it behind me and stoked the fire in the stove until warmth filled the room. Max shook off the rain and settled beside me, his eyes sharp and alert. Outside, the rain pounded the roof and windows, the sound filling every corner of the small cabin. I settled in for the night, but sleep didn't come easy. The storm made the walls creak and groan. I heard branches tapping against the windows and the distant howl of the wind. Max stayed awake, occasionally growling at sounds I couldn't place. There was a feeling of unease hanging over us, an almost electric tension that made my skin prickle. Around midnight, something happened that changed everything. I was dozing by the fire when Max suddenly stood, ears perked, and his body tense. I heard a low noise outside, something like a shuffle or scrape against the cabin's side. Max growled deeper, a warning rumble that vibrated in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door a crack. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but the forest was still dark and heavy. I scanned the edge of the trees, the beam cutting through the shadows. There was a faint movement just beyond the reach of the light, a dark figure slipping between the trunks. I closed the door quickly and locked it, heart pounding. Max was barking now, a deep, relentless bark that shook the cabin. I didn't want to believe it, but someone was out there. Someone who didn't belong in these woods at this hour. The next few hours were a blur of fear and vigilance. I sat by the stove, flashlight in hand, listening to every sound outside. The storm had passed, but the forest was still alive with noises. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, distant footsteps. Max never left my side, his presence the only thing keeping me calm. At dawn, I cautiously opened the door to check outside. The ground was soft and muddy, and I found footprints leading around the cabin. They were large boots, the kind you see on hunters or campers. But whoever it was, they hadn't tried to break in, only circled the cabin, watching. I didn't sleep the next day. I fortified the cabin as best as I could, blocking windows, stacking more firewood by the door, and making sure Max had fresh water and food. I stayed alert, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. By nightfall, the unease hadn't left. I could tell I wasn't alone out here, and I feared whoever had been watching would come back. I kept the fire burning bright, the light spilling out into the darkness like a beacon. Around 11 p.m., I heard it again, scraping sounds at the back of the cabin. Max growled and bared his teeth, the muscles in his neck tense as he stood in front of me, ready to defend. I grabbed the shotgun I had brought for protection, my hands trembling slightly but steady. The sound grew louder, slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. Suddenly, a figure stepped into the firelight. A man, tall and lean, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. His eyes glinted with something I couldn't place, malice or desperation. He didn't speak. Instead, he stared at me, waiting. Max barked furiously, stepping forward, but I held him back. The man took a step back, then turned and vanished into the woods. I locked all the doors and windows, checked the shotgun, and sat by the fire with Max until dawn. The next morning, I packed everything up. I wasn't about to spend another night with someone lurking in the woods outside my cabin. I drove out slowly, eyes scanning the trees, heart racing every time a shadow moved in the corner of my vision. When I got back to the city, I called the local sheriff's office to report what happened. They took down my statement but told me that the woods were known for trespassers, hunters, drifters, sometimes worse. I never returned to that cabin. It was supposed to be a refuge, a place to find peace, but the experience changed something in me. I realized that out in the wild, away from the safety of others, you're vulnerable in ways you can't always prepare for. Max never forgot that night either. Whenever I take him on walks in the city, he's alert to every sound, every movement. The woods taught us both to be wary, to trust instincts, and to respect the darkness. Not because of ghosts or monsters, but because people can be just as frightening. That cabin is still out there, surrounded by pines and silence. And though the storms come and go, some things remain. The memory of a night when the real terror wasn't the dark itself, but what hides in it. It was late autumn in 1993 when I decided to take a week off from work and go on a solo camping trip. I was 29, living in a small town in northern Wisconsin, and the cabin I planned to stay in belonged to an old family friend, Mr. Harlan. He was an aging man who had owned a little cabin deep in the woods for decades. I had spent some summers there as a kid, but never alone. This time, I wanted solitude and peace. No city noise, no deadlines, no responsibilities. The trip started on a gray Monday morning. I loaded my truck with all the gear I needed: a heavy-duty sleeping bag, a camping stove, canned food, water, a flashlight, a hunting knife, and a first aid kit. I also brought my hunting rifle, more for protection than anything else. The autumn woods could be unpredictable, and I like to be prepared. The forecast said there was a chance of rain later in the week. The drive was quiet. I followed the old dirt roads leading into the forest, the air getting cooler and crisper with every mile. The trees had started to lose their leaves, the ground thick with orange and brown foliage. It was peaceful, exactly what I wanted. By late afternoon, I arrived at the small clearing where the cabin stood. It was a modest, weathered wooden structure, just big enough for one or two people. The front porch sagged a bit, and the windows were grimy from years of neglect. I unlocked the door with the key Harlan had given me months earlier and stepped inside. The cabin smelled of dust and old wood, but also something else. A faint, musty odor I didn't recognize at first. I set down my bags and opened the windows to let in fresh air. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books, some fishing gear, and a few faded photographs of Harlan and his family. A small wood stove sat in the corner, blackened from use. I spent the next hour unpacking and preparing the cabin for the week. I stacked some firewood next to the stove and cleared off the small kitchen table. The cabin was basic, no electricity, no running water, but it had everything I needed. After dinner, I sat by the window watching the forest. The sky had turned a dull gray, and a light drizzle began to fall. That night, I slept poorly. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain tapped against the roof in a steady rhythm. Every creak of the cabin sounded unnerving in the dark silence. I kept my flashlight and rifle within reach on the bed. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the ground was soaked. I decided to explore the surrounding woods, hoping to find some firewood and maybe a better source of water. The forest was thick with fallen leaves, making my footsteps muffled and soft. I walked slowly, alert for any signs of wildlife. After about an hour, I stumbled on an overgrown path I hadn't noticed before. Curiosity pulled me deeper. The trees around me grew taller and closer, and the light dimmed under the thick canopy. The path ended abruptly at a small clearing. At its center was another cabin, smaller and more run down than Harlan's. I hadn't known there was another cabin this close. The door was closed but not locked. Something about the place felt off. The wood was rotten and blackened, and the windows were shattered. I didn't want to stay long, but I felt compelled to look inside. Pushing the door open with a creak, I stepped into darkness. The air inside was stale, heavy, and cold. I pulled out my flashlight and swept the beam across the room. At first, I only saw broken furniture and debris, but then my light caught on something strange on the floor. It was a body, lying face down, partly covered with a dirty blanket. At first, I thought it was a mannequin or a prank, but the smell hit me before my mind could deny it. It was the unmistakable stench of death. The skin was pale and blotchy, the clothes tattered and soaked with dirt and old blood. My heart pounded hard. I stepped back slowly, almost tripping over a broken chair. The mind tried to make sense of what I was seeing. How long had this person been here? Who were they? Why was the cabin abandoned? I pulled out my cell phone, but there was no signal. The forest seemed to swallow any connection. I knew I had to get back to Harlan's cabin and call the police, but the thought of moving past that body made me nauseous. After taking a deep breath, I left the cabin and headed back the way I came. The sky was growing darker, clouds thickening again. I hurried, glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt alive with unseen eyes watching me. Back at Harlan's cabin, I locked all the doors and windows. I called the sheriff's office from the landline phone Harlan had installed, explaining what I found. They said they'd send someone out as soon as possible, but it could take hours. The waiting was unbearable. I sat by the wood stove, gripping my rifle, every creak and rustle outside making me jump. The rain started again, heavier this time. When the deputies arrived, two of them, they took one look at the cabin and then at me, their expressions grim. They went to check the other cabin. I waited outside in the cold rain. They came back silent. The dead man was identified later as a drifter who had been reported missing weeks earlier. The cause of death wasn't clear immediately, but the cabin was a crime scene. The police stayed overnight, and I helped with some details. Eventually, the investigation revealed the man had been killed in a robbery gone wrong, then dumped in that cabin. The murderer had disappeared, probably fled the state. I left the woods the next morning, my mind heavy. The peaceful trip I had planned turned into a grim confrontation with death in the wilderness. The silence of the forest had been broken by a terrible secret, hidden in the rotting walls of a forgotten cabin. Even now, years later, I can't forget the smell, the sight of that body, or the cold dread that settled in my bones as I stood there, alone in the rain. I first learned about the cabin when I inherited it from my uncle, who had passed away unexpectedly the year before. The cabin sat deep in the black pine forest, a dense stretch of land on the outskirts of northern Minnesota, a place so remote that cell phone signals were almost non-existent. It was 1998 when I decided to make the trip to see the cabin for myself, wanting to understand what my uncle had left behind. I was 29 years old, and at the time working as a mechanic in Minneapolis. I was tired of the constant noise of the city and the monotony of daily life. The idea of a quiet place, a cabin surrounded by nothing but trees, was appealing. The journey took almost 6 hours by car, with the last stretch being a narrow dirt road that wound through thick woods. The forest felt alive. Every so often the wind pushed branches, creating a constant rustling sound that filled the air. I didn't see another car the whole way. When I finally arrived, the cabin was tucked away at the end of a small clearing, barely visible through the tall black pines that surrounded it. It looked old, maybe built in the 1940s, with weathered wood and a rusty tin roof. The porch was sagging on one side, and the windows were grimy but intact. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not just the absence of sound, but the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes your own breathing seem loud. The kind of silence that feels unnatural, like the forest is holding its breath. I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under my boots. Inside, the cabin smelled like damp wood, old pine, and something else. A faint, almost metallic scent that I couldn't place. Dust covered everything, except the area around the fireplace where it looked like someone had been burning logs recently. There were old newspapers scattered on a small table, dated back to the 1970s. A rusty kettle sat on the stove, and a few mismatched chairs stood around a rickety table. I set my bag down and opened the windows to let in fresh air, but the wind that swept through was cold and sharp, making me pull my jacket tighter around me. I had come prepared for the cold, but I didn't expect the air to feel so raw. That first night, I lit a fire in the hearth. The flames flickered and cast long shadows on the wooden walls, the only source of light in the cabin apart from a small, dim lantern. I settled into one of the chairs, a book in my lap, but I found it hard to focus. The forest outside seemed alive in a way that made me uneasy. Every snap of a twig, every distant rustle set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, I heard the first strange noise. It was faint at first, like a soft thud against the cabin's outer wall. I thought it might be an animal, a raccoon or a squirrel. But when the noise repeated, rhythmic and slow, I realized it sounded deliberate. Something was tapping on the wood. Not hard, but enough to hear clearly. I didn't want to investigate. I told myself it was nothing, probably a branch hitting the side of the cabin in the wind. But the taps continued intermittently throughout the night. I lay awake, heart pounding, listening to the wind and the tapping, wishing daylight would come sooner. The next morning, I checked the outside walls carefully but found nothing. No marks, no damage, no sign of animals. The ground around the cabin was soft from rain, but I didn't see any tracks near the wall where I'd heard the tapping. It was as if nothing had been there. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks. Still, I decided to spend the day exploring the woods nearby. Maybe getting out of the cabin would help clear my head. The forest was thick and dark under the tall pines. The ground was soft and damp, covered in pine needles and fallen leaves. I walked for hours, following a narrow animal trail that twisted through the trees. I found an old hunting blind, half collapsed, and the remains of a fire pit with blackened stones. It looked like someone had been here recently, but no sign of people now. As I walked back, I thought about how isolated this place was. There were no neighbors within miles, no trails, no roads, just the forest stretching in every direction. That night, the tapping started again. Louder this time, more persistent. I sat by the fire, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for something to happen. The wind howled outside, shaking the cabin. Then, suddenly, there was a loud bang against the window. I jumped to my feet and grabbed the lantern. My hands trembled as I moved to look outside, but the darkness was thick and complete. No sign of movement, no shadow, nothing. I wanted to convince myself it was just a branch or some animal, but my gut told me something was wrong. I felt like I was being watched. Sleep came late and restless. The next morning, I decided to leave the cabin for a while and drive back into town to buy some supplies. I packed my bag, locked the door behind me, and headed down the dirt road. As I drove, the feeling of unease stayed with me. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following, but there was only empty forest. Back in town, I stocked up on food, batteries, and a few extra tools. I also bought a small handheld radio, hoping to have some contact with the outside world while I was at the cabin. Returning to the cabin felt different. The forest seemed darker, heavier somehow. The sun was setting as I pulled up to the clearing, casting long shadows. Inside, I lit the fire again, unpacked my things, and sat down. The radio was quiet except for static, but at least it was something. Then I heard footsteps, not outside the cabin, but inside. Slow, deliberate steps on the wooden floor above me. The cabin only had one floor, no attic. I was alone. I froze, heart pounding. The steps stopped, and the silence returned, thick and suffocating. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and started checking every room carefully. Nothing. No sign that anyone had been there. I convinced myself I was imagining things, maybe my nerves playing tricks. But I locked the doors extra tight that night, placing a heavy chair against the main door. The following days passed in a blur of small noises. Scratches on the walls, the tapping on the windows, footsteps outside in the underbrush. I barely slept, always listening for the next sound. One evening, while checking the perimeter, I found fresh footprints in the soft mud near the cabin. They were large, boot-shaped prints heading into the woods. I followed them for a few hundred yards, but the trail disappeared. This was no animal. I started to suspect someone was watching me, maybe even living nearby, hidden in the forest. The next night was the worst. The tapping on the walls started again, but this time accompanied by faint voices outside. I couldn't make out what they said, but the sound was close, just beyond the windows. The wind died down, making the noises even more distinct. I stayed inside, trembling, waiting for morning. At first light, I went outside and found something chilling. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt road leading away from the cabin. Someone had been there recently, no doubt. That was when I realized I wasn't alone in the woods. I packed my bags immediately and prepared to leave. But just as I was about to get in the car, I heard a voice call my name from the edge of the forest. Clear, steady, and calm. I froze, scanning the tree line, but saw no one. I didn't wait any longer. I got in the car and drove away as fast as I could, the forest behind me feeling like a trap. When I finally reached the highway, I called my closest friend and told him everything. He said he would come and check the place out. Days later, the police arrived. They searched the area, found some old makeshift campsites deep in the woods, but no one was there now. They told me the forest had a history of illegal activity. Drug growers, poachers, sometimes squatters, people hiding from the law or from their past. The tapping, the footsteps, the voices, none of it was supernatural. It was real people watching, waiting, hiding. I never returned to the cabin. The place that once promised peace became a nightmare I wanted to forget. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear that tapping in my mind.